Welcome back. We were talking about language socialization, and we need to start talking about capitalizing on cultural values to help students find motivation. A study done in Korea, where English is an important, or South Korea, where English is an important part of education and a part of why South Korea has been so successful. And a study was done on the practices of teachers of English. And what they found is that teachers frequently capitalize on cultural values based in Confucianism, which has to do with ranking and order and competition. And in countries like South Korea, competition permeates their culture. Students are very interested in status, in how they stand in relation to other people, and they're very conscious about that. And so what these teachers do is they regularly rank students as a way to motivate them. Because even if you're at the bottom of the list, or toward the bottom of the list, you still want to do well because you can reach a higher status. And in that culture, that's a very strong, very potent part of the culture. So that's one way that we can socialize students into being motivated to use it, is because we want them to be competitive, not too competitive, but we want them to compete with each other, to sound better, to conjugate better, to use the language better. A similar study, though with a different outcome, was done in Hong Kong in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. Hong Kong used to be a British colony. It was a British colony from 1842 to 1997, when it became a special administrative region of the People's Republic of China and British control ceased. Hong Kong still has a lot of autonomy, and both politically, economically, and socially, but it's not an independent country. And in Hong Kong, the use of English changed during the 20th century. It used to be just a wealthy person's language in addition to Cantonese, which is just kind of the common geographical language. And it went from being sort of a highbrow language is something that was taught to everyone. Everyone learned English in public school by the 1970s and 1960s. A professor named Regina Low did a pretty intensive round of observational studies as to why English proficiency was stagnant and wasn't increasing, wasn't getting better. She found several disturbing things that she criticized very heavily. But the first thing that she found was that there was just such a sudden transition from using English as an educational language, as from just sort of a language that people in business and government use, to sort of like, oh, all of a sudden I need to use English. And this is because English was not very widely taught in primary school, and then in secondary school it was the only medium of education. Because in primary school they only learn Cantonese and they only speak Cantonese, and all of a sudden they have to know English. And so she suggested that the schools use a graduated system so that you can gradually introduce English during primary school, and then but the bulk of content teaching is done in Cantonese, and then in high school we need to move to the bulk of content is taught in English to prepare for tertiary education. And so that was her first point. Her second point is that there just needs to be more administrative oversight, which doesn't really relate to the topic, but it's important in that, reinforcing this need of knowing to know this foreign language and being able to use the system and structure in place to make sure that students are hitting certain targets at the right time, and that we put into place this graduated system. And then the last thing is that she felt that using English stuff that was already in Hong Kong, already being produced in Hong Kong, would make learning English much more successful. So in Hong Kong, there are newspapers, TV shows, news stations, English music, business, science, education. There's so much that is already done in English, but it wasn't being used in the classroom. And so she felt that if we make this language relevant to these students now, much in line with what these European studies have found, that if we make English relevant right now, and saying, oh, I don't just have to know Cantonese to get around in Hong Kong. I can also know English, and the English is useful. She felt that that was going to be an important thing that needed to be put into place and brought into the classroom. This relevance, this idea of making things relevant. So these are the applications that she felt were really important. She saw this graduated system was important so that we start learning when we're younger, so that we do incorporate this critical age hypothesis, but then we go beyond that. That we don't just rely on that, that we make English something that's relevant and important, and that we make these students think about it, and what does it mean, and what does all of this stuff that's going on in my city that's done in English and not just in Cantonese, what does it all mean? So she felt that maintaining exposure was really important, maintaining exposure. So exposing when we're young, and then keep saturating the environment with this English media and English stuff. And then the last thing, was just stressing this importance of cultural relevance. So that if we don't socialize children and teenagers to realize that this language, learning another language, is important, that it will not be effective. So going back to why this is such a problem is that we cannot just rely on this narrow scope, narrow vision of critical age hypothesis window. We have to go beyond that. We have to keep researching into these differences. So some of the differences that were found is that the L2, that in the student or the learner that is learning a foreign language, they actually put this new language in a different part of the brain. So because they've started at a later time, as the brain development moves from the back of the brain to the front of the brain, the language learning, the mother tongue, where the mother tongue is in the brain, is different than where the L2 part of it is. So the whole brain allocation of where language will be, it's all different in learners. So knowing that that is different, that these people learn differently than these young learners, that older learners learn differently than younger learners, is extremely important. More research has found that when we use this model of naive native judges, so we have people that are judging pronunciation and sentence and complicatedness of syntax and things like that, then when we are using these, but they don't know what they're measuring, that we find out that actually about a third of older learners who are advanced in learning this language actually have achieved perfect fluency when they interact with naive native judges. But what they found with these naive judges is that in the groups of people that are these younger learners who started learning when they were younger and maintained exposure, like what Regina Lowe was advocating, is that these younger learners who've continued their exposure, actually the naive native judges perceived a slightly higher ease of communication and pronunciation. So what this means in the long run is that ultimately, while there's no difference in syntax use and vocabulary size and grammar use, that actually younger learners do seem to have a slightly higher ease of communication and pronunciation. But then we look at the third of older learners that just don't seem to follow. So that's the reason why critical age hypothesis is problematic, and there are also variations in the younger groups of people that that some of them, on average, some of them were higher and some of them were lower in their ease of communication. So let's look back at Amelie and Noah. This is why it's so problematic. Noah's classmates could all be native English speakers. So where is he going to pick up native-like fluency if his teacher is also a native speaker of English? Like, where will he get this superhuman understanding and ability to use native-like communication? I mean, where is he going to get that? That's a problem. Then if we look at Amelie, well, her parents are pretty well off. What if she gets a tutor? She's going to have increased practice and usage, and so in the long run she'll be able to have a better command in the long run, better command of English. So if she's surrounded by classmates that also speak English as a native language, she will just do better. And so this is why critical age hypothesis is such a problem. Is Amelie winning then if we take into these variations? Well, She's literate and fluent in French. That means that she has metalinguistic awareness. So, she's been stimulated by the literature and spoken language of her mother tongue. So, according to this metalinguistic awareness idea, Amelie will search for connections between French and English, and she will have this drive to have good grammar, a large vocabulary, complex sentence construction, wanting to express oneself creatively in speaking and writing. All of that is present in her L1, it will bleed over into L2. So that's why Amelie seems like she's winning. But again, with learning language, there aren't winners and losers. There are just some people that do better than others. So then we look at Noah. Noah is still learning English. I mean, he doesn't have a fluent command over English. He's still learning how to listen to people, how to speak to people, how to read, how to write. And so he's trying to do this at the same time that he's also acquiring a second language. So acquiring that second language will be much, much, much slower because he still has to refine his L1. Whereas Amelie has already done her L1 refinement. She doesn't have much left. All she'll do is really refine vocabulary and maybe some sentence complexity, but she can focus completely on L2, which is why it seems like she's winning. But in the end, if we follow this norm, Noah will, if he follows the norm, will sound more like a native Spanish speaker than Amelie will sound like a native English speaker. So, going back to the thesis, does age matter when it comes to older learners of English? Well, yes and no. We know that about a third of them deviate from the norm, at least in older learners. We know that the only thing that's affected is their ease of pronunciation. And we also know that there are just brain differences in older learners and younger learners that would just learn differently. But even when we take into consideration all of this, critical age hypothesis still seems outdated. We know that there are structural differences. We can take better pictures of the brain. We can do more research and studies. We have better tools that are available, people that are interested in this. So I think what needs to happen, in conclusion, is that there needs to be a pedagogic shift away from listen and repeat. It's about your accent. You don't want to sound like you're from a different place. You know what? You just have to sound like you. You have to sound like yourself. And it's not like we need to conform to some sort of monolithic standard of the language. Even though that's desirable in some languages, we need to shift toward this idea of interlanguage and just practicing and using and interacting with native speakers and making foreign language acquisition relevant. And I think that if that's done, that we'll see more success when it comes to acquiring a language, and we won't see any more of this disinterested feelings and attitudes toward learning a second language, whether it's in the United States or in any foreign country.